In this playlist, I focus on traveling to locations associated with mathematicians. Today we're visiting Burntisland Parish Kirk, which is the childhood church of Mary Fairfax Somerville. Note that I'll use the words church and Kirk interchangeably. I do have a video of Mary's early life in Burntisland in Edinburgh, which I'll link above and in the description below. There was too much information about this church and her faith to include there, hence this video. Mary's faith played a huge role in her life, but it wasn't always an easy journey, to say the least. I'll start by highlighting the church, the building, its history, its kirkyard, and later in the video I'll talk a bit about Mary's experiences here and her faith life. Built in 1592, Burntisland Parish Kirk was the first church constructed in Scotland after the arrival of the Reformation. Much of the Kirk's history can be seen recorded on panels and columns. This church is where King James was first approached about commissioning an authorized English translation of the Bible. This happened during the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, which was hosted here in 1601. Back when James was king in Scotland, but not yet in England. The church has an unusual shape, that of a square, and the idea behind this was that services are a gathering of the family of God around the table where His Word is shared. This is expressed much better by Alec Taylor, who graciously provided an informative tour of the building and the kirkyard.
Family sitting around the table, listening to the word of the Lord. That was the reason for the reasoning behind the square church. That's the only one I've heard, and I think there are others in France, and there might be one in Holland or the Netherlands.
Another feature of the church is its organ, which was gifted by Andrew Carnegie. He visited here and was so impressed that he asked if there was anything the church needed. The minister mentioned an organ, and not long after an organ appeared at the church door. Some assembly required. I can't deny that I was very happy to get a chance to try out this organ. The console is in the gallery, and from up here you can get an even better view of the square shape of the church. The kirkyard is interesting and atmospheric. And Mary's father, William Fairfax, and her mother, Margaret Charters, are buried here. Above the door of the church is a symbol that I wouldn't have noticed if Alec hadn't pointed it out to me, the symbol of an upside-down anchor. The anchor is a symbol of hope, and the fact that it is upside down indicates where Christian hope is rooted and grounded, which is in heaven rather than on earth. This symbol is repeated above the sailor's door at the back of the kirk. So all of that is some information about the church itself. Let's shift now to Mary's journey in church and in faith. To do so, we need to step back a few years. Though Mary's family home was in Burntisland, this is not where she was born. At the time of her birth, her father, a vice admiral in the Navy, was away at sea, so her mom was staying with family in the Scottish border town of Edinburgh. Mary's uncle, the Reverend Thomas Somerville, was minister at Edinburgh Abbey, and Mary was born in the manse of the abbey. Nothing remains of the manse, or parsonage, but it stood on the grassy area on the left of this photo. It should be noted that her uncle, Thomas, was one of the few people, perhaps the only person, who encouraged Mary in her studies during her youth. Edinburgh Abbey, which dates back to the 1100s, was in ruins already when Mary was born, but worship could still take place in the western part of the nave at that time. The family visited here on occasion during Mary's childhood, and she had fond memories of playing in the nearby river known as the Jedwater. But for now, let's head back up north to her childhood church in Burnt Island. It is still known which pew her family sat in for services. In this picture, it's the one nearest my guides, Toby and Alec. Here's a picture of it from the opposite direction. In relationship to church, Mary records in her memoirs that Thursday was a day of preparation, with morning worship consisting of a psalm, a prayer, an hour-long lecture, another psalm, another prayer, an hour-long sermon, another psalm, another prayer, and a benediction, after which everyone went home for a meal and then returned for an afternoon service. Then on Friday, Mary and the other young people went to the minister to receive a stamped piece of lead as a token for admission to Christ's table Sunday, if they could show they were sufficiently instructed. There was a morning service Saturday and a morning service Sunday in which there were devotions, a sermon, communion, and singing. Then on Monday was the same long morning service as Thursday. I think what she's describing here may have been special summer services for when the weather was good and crowds came in from neighboring parishes for the preaching. So it may be that it was somewhat less extensive at other times of the year. Of her experience of sermons, she has this to say in her memoirs.
Our minister was a rigid Calvinist. His sermons were gloomy and so long that he occasionally would startle the congregation by calling out to some culprit, "Sit up there, how dare you sleep in the kirk?" Some sawmills in the neighbourhood were burnt down, so the following Sunday we had a sermon on hellfire.
The multiple lengthy services could be particularly hard for Mary, especially when her beloved brother Sam was gone to university. He would come home on Saturday and return to Edinburgh on Monday, so Sunday was the only full day they had together. They wanted to spend that day talking and sitting by the water, watching for whales and dolphins. They did sometimes skip the Sunday afternoon service, but the minister would call them out on that, noticing the absence and asking if they had been ill. Obviously, Mary's experience with this wouldn't have been very different to that of anyone growing up in Scotland at that time. But in adulthood, her work in the sciences brought faith challenges as well. She became so well known in scientific circles that she was nicknamed the Queen of 19th century science. And there were many discoveries at this time that seemed to conflict with faith for some. Among these discoveries were James Hutton's work on geology and Charles Darwin's work on evolution. These did not shake her faith, nor did her faith hold her back from science. One thing Mary was known for was writing books for a general audience that explained these new advances in science. Her scientific findings were not always well received by the church, and at one point she was denounced from the pulpit of York Minster. She was publicly censured there by name. Despite the overbearing nature of her religious upbringing, her deep involvement with scientific advances, and this later censure from the church, she never turned away from Christianity. Here are more words from her memoirs, mentioning again the sermons, but also the Bible, which she never stopped reading.
It was too much for me. I always came home with a headache and took a dislike to sermons, which continues to this day, and in afterlife I could no longer believe in the gloomy doctrines of Calvinism, but I have always kept up my early habit of reading the Bible. In youth I liked it for its sublime poetry. Later in life, it has been my only consolation in severe affliction.
Mary's daughter writes of Mary that her faith retained its deep roots, which began in her childhood church in Burnt Island, and that it influenced every thought and action of her life. Her mind remained clear and strong, right up to her death at age 92. Throughout her long life, she held fast to what she held to be true, both in science and in faith.